Mark had been on countless missions before, but none like this. The planet he had landed on was vast and mysterious, with towering structures made of smooth stone, reflecting the alien civilization's advanced technology. The mission seemed simple: deliver supplies to the royal palace. But as he walked toward the palace gates, something felt different. The air was thick with tension, and the hum of the city's energy seemed to vibrate through his boots. As he stepped into the grand palace, Mark was in awe of the sheer beauty of the place. The walls were adorned with intricate designs, glowing faintly in the dim light, but none of that compared to the sight of the princess herself. The king's daughter stood in front of a large window, gazing out at the city below. Her face was a perfect blend of grace and power, yet there was something almost sorrowful about her expression. Mark had heard the stories. The princess was known across the galaxy for her beauty and her strength. She was said to be unapproachable, cold even, to all but those of her royal bloodline. No one, especially not a human like Mark, had ever dared to approach her. But today, things were different. The princess slowly turned to face him, her piercing eyes meeting his. Mark froze. She was even more stunning up close, but her gaze seemed to hold a hint of desperation. You're human," she said softly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Mark nodded, unsure of what to say. He had heard rumors that the princess was cold, unfeeling, and that no one could get close to her. But now, standing before him, she looked vulnerable. "I need your help," she whispered, barely audible. Mark's heart skipped a beat. What could the powerful alien princess possibly need from a human soldier like him? His mind raced with questions. Was this a trap? Was she testing him? But her eyes, filled with a strange mix of fear and trust, told him this was no ordinary request. Without thinking, he stepped closer, ready to hear her out. Whatever her reason was, this was an opportunity Mark could not ignore. Little did he know, his decision in this moment would change his life and his mission forever. Mark stood frozen, unsure how to respond. The princess, an alien being of power and beauty, was asking for his help. It was unheard of. No human had ever been trusted with such a request from a member of royalty. His mind raced, and for a moment, he questioned whether he had heard her right. But the princess's gaze never wavered. Her eyes were full of urgency, and there was something in her expression that made it impossible to turn away. "You are the only one who can help me," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Please." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had come to this planet simply to drop off supplies, but he had never expected something like this. The royal palace, with all its grandeur and mystery, suddenly felt overwhelming. And yet, standing in front of him was the alien princess, the one whose name was spoken with awe and fear across the galaxy, pleading with him. "What do you need from me?" Mark asked, his voice steady despite the questions swirling in his mind. The princess hesitated, as if she wasn't sure whether she could trust him or if she should reveal the full truth. But the weight of her situation was clear in her eyes. She looked hungry, not just for food, but for something more, something she had been denied for too long. Mark could feel the tension in the air, thick with unspoken words. "Food," she said simply, her voice soft, "but not just any food. It's a rare delicacy from your planet. It's the only thing that can sustain me right now. Without it, I won't survive." Mark felt a jolt of confusion. Food. That was it. This was what the princess needed from him. "The royal palace has everything," he said, trying to understand. "Why can't you get it here?" Her gaze darkened for a brief moment, and Mark could see the layers of frustration and helplessness beneath the surface. "It's a matter of tradition. The rare fruit I need doesn't grow here. It's only available on Earth." Mark's mind raced. Earth. He hadn't been home in months, and the thought of bringing something back to the princess from Earth seemed almost impossible. But there was something in her expression that made him hesitate. Something in the way she looked at him made him want to help her. Despite the enormity of her request, despite the risks, Mark felt an overwhelming need to say yes. "How much do you need?" he asked quietly, already making plans in his mind. The princess's eyes softened, and for the first time, she smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy, but one of relief, a rare glimpse of vulnerability. "Just one. But it must be from Earth." Mark nodded, determined. He had no idea what he was getting into. But this moment, this request, was something he could not ignore. He would find a way to help her, whatever it took. But as he turned to leave, he felt a shiver run down his spine. Something was off about the situation. The princess, despite her desperate plea, seemed to know more than she was letting on, and Mark was about to uncover a secret far greater than just the need for a rare fruit. Something much deeper and far more dangerous was at play. The moment he left the palace, he realized that his simple delivery mission had just turned into a much more complicated and life-altering adventure. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something far bigger than himself. As he walked away from the palace, the weight of the princess's request pressed on him. It was just food, right? But it didn't feel like that. There was an urgency in her voice, a desperation that made him question the real reason behind her plea. Why would an alien princess, powerful and commanding, need something as simple as food from Earth? And why did she seem so vulnerable? He had to know more. Mark returned to his ship, the quiet hum of the engines a stark contrast to the chaos of thoughts swirling in his mind. He was already halfway to Earth, his course set, but he couldn't help but feel that there was more to this than a simple mission for a rare fruit. The princess's eyes, full of something he couldn't place, haunted him. She had looked at him as if she expected him to understand something greater, something that hadn't been said out loud. As the ship cut through the dark void of space, Mark spent the next few hours researching. He accessed his ship's database, scanning through every record on the alien species he had encountered during his missions. But when he reached the files on the royal family of the planet he was currently on, he found nothing useful. Everything was marked as classified. Not even a single detail about their customs or vulnerabilities. Frustration built inside him. This wasn't just a regular mission anymore. The princess had asked him for help in a way no one else would ever dream of. What was so special about this fruit? Why was she so desperate for it? Hours passed, and Mark's ship finally approached Earth. The familiar blue and green of his home planet filled his view as he prepared to make his landing. He could only hope that whatever this fruit was, it would be easy to find. He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of urgency. The thought of returning to the princess with nothing was unbearable. But it wasn't just the fruit that haunted his thoughts. It was her. She had looked at him as if she had placed her trust in him. He landed the ship in a secluded spot on Earth, away from prying eyes. Mark had experience with covert operations, so he was confident that he could retrieve the fruit without drawing attention. But as he stepped out onto the familiar soil of Earth, a sense of unease settled in. The task before him felt deceptively simple, yet there was an underlying tension that tugged at his instincts. He walked through the forest, his eyes scanning the terrain. The fruit he was looking for was rare, only found in the deepest parts of Earth's remote forests. It wasn't something one could simply pick from a market stand. He had heard whispers of it in the past, but it was more myth than reality. As he ventured deeper into the woods, Mark's mind kept returning to the princess's words. "I won't survive without it." What could be so important about this fruit that a princess would be willing to beg a stranger, a human, for it? Minutes turned into hours, but Mark refused to give up. He was too close now, and the thought of the princess waiting for him only spurred him forward. After another hour of searching, he stumbled upon a patch of unusual trees, their bark shining with a faint otherworldly glow. At the base of one tree, nestled within its roots, was the fruit. It was unlike anything Mark had ever seen. The fruit glowed softly, a deep, almost pulsing blue. He could feel the weight of its significance just by looking at it. This was the fruit the princess had asked for. The one thing that could save her. But as Mark picked the fruit from the ground, A strange feeling washed over him. Something was wrong. The trees around him seemed to bend toward him, and the air grew thick with an unfamiliar tension. He wasn't alone. He spun around, his hand instinctively going to the weapon at his side. But there was no one there, only the eerie whisper of the wind through the trees. Mark's heart raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was drawing him into something far darker than he had anticipated. Still, he took the fruit and made his way back to the ship. There was no turning back now. Whatever awaited him with the princess was a mystery he had to solve. But as he lifted off and headed back into space, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, and that the true test was yet to come. Mark's ship soared through the stars, the eerie silence of space amplifying the growing tension in his chest. He had the fruit in hand, its otherworldly glow pulsating softly in the dim light of the cockpit. The journey back to the princess felt impossibly long. Every minute stretched on, leaden with uncertainty. What had he gotten himself into? As the ship neared the planet, Mark's mind wandered back to the princess. He recalled her pleading eyes and the strange, almost desperate tone in her voice when she asked for the fruit. It wasn't just hunger she was feeling. There was something deeper, something urgent that Mark hadn't yet uncovered. She had seemed like an invincible leader, but now she seemed like something far more fragile, someone with a hidden weakness. When he landed back on the royal grounds, a sense of foreboding settled over him. The princess was waiting for him, just as he had promised. Her regal figure stood at the entrance to the palace, her gaze fixed on his ship as it touched down. She had a quiet elegance about her, but there was something in her stance, an unreadable tension, that Mark couldn't ignore. It was as if she was both relieved and afraid of what was to come. Mark stepped out of the ship, clutching the glowing fruit in his hands. The princess approached, her eyes locked on the prize he held. He felt her gaze pierce through him, but there was a hesitation there too, as if she wasn't sure whether to welcome him or not. "Did you find it?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Her composure was still flawless, but Mark could sense the vulnerability lurking just beneath the surface. Mark nodded and handed her the fruit. "I found it. But there's something strange about it. I don't understand why you need this so urgently." The princess took the fruit carefully, her fingers brushing against his briefly, sending a jolt of electricity through his body. She looked at it, her eyes softening. There was something deeply personal about this moment, and Mark felt like he was witnessing something sacred, something not meant for outsiders. "It's not just a fruit," she said quietly, almost to herself. "This is the last of its kind. It holds more than just nourishment. It holds my people's future." Mark furrowed his brow. "Your people's future?" The princess nodded, her expression turning serious. "The fruit contains a rare healing energy. It can restore the balance of our planet, but more importantly, it can heal me." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "Without it, I would have died." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, heal you?" She swallowed, looking away for a moment as if gathering her thoughts. When she met his gaze again, there was a flicker of pain in her eyes. "I've been cursed. The curse is tied to my bloodline, one that no one has been able to break. I carry a sickness that slowly kills me, draining my strength, my energy. And only this fruit can save me." Mark was taken aback. He had never imagined something like this. A curse. An alien princess, cursed and on the brink of death. It sounded like something out of a storybook. But here she was, standing in front of him, vulnerable in a way he had never seen before. "But you're a princess. You should be invincible," Mark said, unable to hide the shock in his voice. She smiled softly, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Even the most powerful are not immune to fate. I was born with this curse, and I have spent my life searching for a way to end it. But now, after all these years, I found the only way to survive." Mark's mind raced. This wasn't just a simple request for food. It was a matter of life and death. The princess's entire life had been a struggle against something she couldn't control. and now he had the power to change it. The tension between them was thick, and for the first time, Mark realized the enormity of the decision before him. He had been a soldier his whole life, fighting battles, following orders, but this was different. He wasn't just helping an alien princess with her royal duties. He was playing a part in something that could change the course of her fate. "Then you need this fruit," Mark said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "But how does it work? What exactly happens when you consume it?" The princess's gaze softened. "When I eat it, it will heal the curse within me. It will restore my health and give me the strength I've lost. But it's not just about me. The fruit has the power to revitalize my people, to bring hope to a dying world." Mark watched as she carefully peeled the fruit, her hands trembling just slightly. Her regal composure had faltered, but only for a moment. She took a deep breath before taking the first bite, her eyes closing as she seemed to savor it. The air around them seemed to shift as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Mark's heart raced as he waited for her to finish. Would this work? Would it heal her? The princess had placed her trust in him. And now, all they could do was wait. But Mark knew one thing for certain. The princess was no longer the untouchable ruler she had once seemed. She was human, just like him. And her survival now depended on him. The princess finished eating the fruit, and for a long moment, nothing happened. Mark watched her carefully, his pulse racing with anticipation. The quiet tension in the air was almost unbearable, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Mark's mind raced as he wondered if the fruit had truly worked. Was this just another failure in her long battle with the curse? Then suddenly her eyes snapped open, and Mark saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Her eyes, which had once been clouded with pain and weakness, were now sharp and vibrant, glowing with an energy Mark hadn't seen before. It was as if a veil had been lifted from her. Her gaze was no longer burdened with the sorrow of an endless struggle. It was clear that something had changed, something powerful, something life-altering. She stood up straight, the grace and power of her royal stature returning. Her posture was no longer fragile, but strong, filled with the kind of authority Mark had seen only in the greatest leaders. It was as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. A smile crept onto her face, one that was equal parts joy and disbelief. She looked at Mark, her eyes full of gratitude. "It worked," she whispered, almost in awe. Mark's heart soared. He had seen her at her lowest, weak and desperate. But now, standing before him, she was a new person, a living testament to the power of the fruit. You're healed," Mark said, still in shock. The princess nodded, her voice filled with a new strength. "Yes, I am. The curse is broken. I feel alive again, stronger than I have ever been." She stepped toward him, her movements fluid and confident. The change in her was undeniable, and Mark couldn't help but marvel at the transformation. Her eyes softened as she looked at him, and for the first time, Mark saw something beyond the regal princess. He saw a woman who had been through unimaginable struggles, who had fought for her life and her people, and now, for the first time in years, she could finally breathe without the fear of death hanging over her. "I can never thank you enough," she said, her voice sincere. "You gave me a chance to live again, to save my people, to restore hope where there was none." Mark felt a warmth spread through him as she spoke. He had never expected anything in return for helping her, but seeing the princess so alive, so full of energy, made him feel as though he had done something truly meaningful. His entire life had been about following orders, about fighting battles that weren't his own. But now, he had changed the fate of an entire planet with a single act of kindness. But just as the weight of what had happened settled in, something else began to stir inside Mark. He had noticed it earlier, but now that the princess was healed, it was impossible to ignore. There was a shift in the air between them, something charged, something that went beyond gratitude. Her gaze lingered on him, a softness in her eyes that Mark couldn't quite place. Mark felt the heat rise in his chest. Was he imagining this? Was the princess, the one who had been so cold and distant at first, now looking at him with something more? It was almost as if the healing had unlocked something else within her. A desire, perhaps, or a new sense of closeness. The princess took a step closer, and Mark's breath caught in his throat. "There is one more thing I need to ask," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "You've helped me when no one else could. You've given me a chance to live. But—" She paused, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that took his breath away. "Now, I need to ask you something else." Mark's heart raced as the weight of her words hung in the air. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I want you to stay. I want you to be a part of my life. I want you to help me lead my people, to rebuild the world that was nearly destroyed by this curse." She stepped even closer, the space between them now non-existent. Her presence was overwhelming, and Mark could feel the pull between them like gravity itself. Mark's mind spun. He had never imagined this. He had come here to help a stranger, a broken princess, and now he was being offered something far beyond what he had ever expected. A place at her side, a chance to change the fate of her world, and perhaps something more. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form a response, the princess reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. Her touch sent a jolt of warmth through him, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The world around them seemed to blur, and all Mark could focus on was her. "I understand if you can't stay," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "But please know, Mark, that you have changed everything. You have given me and my people a future." Mark's heart beat faster, his mind racing. He had never been one to believe in fate, but now, standing before the princess, he couldn't help but wonder if there was something more at play. He had come here as an outsider, just a soldier doing his duty, but now he felt like he was part of something greater, something that could change the course of history. As he looked into her eyes, Mark knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same again. The princess had not only been healed, but so had something deep within him, a connection, a purpose, something he hadn't known he was missing. And whatever happened next, he was ready to face it by her side. The princess stood before Mark, her presence commanding the space between them. Her gaze was soft yet firm, filled with a deep understanding of the responsibility she now carried. The weight of her people's future rested heavily on her shoulders, but in this moment, with Mark standing by her side, she felt a glimmer of hope, a hope that had been absent for far too long. Mark could see the uncertainty in her eyes, but it was mixed with something else, a strength, a determination that he hadn't seen before. She was no longer the fragile, broken figure he had first met. She had been reborn, not just in health, but in spirit, and it was because of him. "You've saved me, Mark," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've given me the one thing I needed most, the chance to lead my people, to rebuild, to live." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He had never thought of himself as a hero. He was just a soldier doing his job. But looking at her now, seeing the fire in her eyes, he couldn't deny the truth. He had done something extraordinary. He had given this alien princess a chance at life, and in doing so, he had changed the course of her world. "Your people are lucky to have you," Mark said, his voice sincere. "You're a leader, not just because of your title, but because of your heart. You've been through so much, and yet you still care about them. You still want to make a difference." The princess smiled softly, a trace of sadness in her eyes. "I've learned that leadership isn't about power or titles. It's about the strength to keep going when everything seems lost. It's about giving hope when there's none left. And it's about having the courage to ask for help when you need it the most." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle deep inside him. He had always believed in the power of hope, but hearing it from someone like her, someone who had been through so much, made him believe in it even more. "I'll stand with you," Mark said, his voice firm. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that whatever happens, I'll help you rebuild. I'll help your people. I'll stand by your side, Princess." The princess's expression softened, and for a moment, she seemed lost in thought. But then, she reached out, her hand brushing against his, a simple gesture that sent a surge of warmth through him. It was an unspoken promise, a bond forged in the fires of struggle and sacrifice. "I knew you were different from the moment I saw you," she said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "You didn't come here for glory or fame. You came because you wanted to help. And now, I need you more than ever." Mark's heart swelled with emotion. He had never expected this, never imagined that a single act of kindness would lead to something so profound. He had come to this alien world as a soldier, a stranger, and now he stood as someone important in the eyes of the princess. She was no longer just a ruler to him. She was someone he admired, someone he wanted to protect. "I'm honored," Mark said, his words heartfelt. "I'll do whatever it takes to help you." The princess's smile grew, and for the first time, Mark saw a true sense of peace in her eyes. It was as though the last remnants of her former self, the broken, isolated figure she had been, had finally been laid to rest. She was no longer just a princess. She was a leader, a symbol of hope for her people. And now, with Mark by her side, she was ready to face the future. "We have a long road ahead of us," the princess said, her tone resolute. "But with you by my side, I know we can rebuild. We can restore what was lost. Together." Mark nodded, his resolve strengthening. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something greater, something worth every sacrifice. As the princess turned to face the horizon, Mark knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The world around them seemed to shift, the darkness of the past receding into the distance. There was still much to do, much to rebuild, but in this moment, it didn't matter. With the princess healed, with their bond stronger than ever, Mark knew they had a chance to bring light to a world that had known only darkness. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the sky, Mark made a promise to himself. He would stand by her, no matter what. Because they were no longer just two strangers on a broken world. They were partners, bound by a shared purpose. And together, they would change the course of history. The days following their conversation were filled with a quiet but undeniable tension. Mark had returned to the makeshift camp where he had spent the last few weeks, working alongside the princess's advisors to rebuild what had been lost. He had seen her transition from a broken leader to one who took charge, making decisions for her people with a confidence that had once been absent. And with every day, he was more impressed with her resilience and strength. But as the weeks passed, a question lingered in the back of Mark's mind. Was he truly ready for this? Was he ready to fully commit to a life in this alien world, beside a woman who would become not just a leader, but the heart of an entire people? One evening, as the last remnants of sunlight faded over the horizon, Mark found himself standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley below. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, and the air was cool with the promise of nightfall. He breathed deeply, allowing the tranquility of the scene to wash over him. Then he heard her. The princess had arrived, her footsteps soft but deliberate as she approached him. He didn't turn to face her, knowing she would stand beside him without needing to be asked. "You're thinking again," she said, her voice gentle but knowing. "What's on your mind?" Mark turned to her, meeting her gaze. There was something different about the way she looked at him now, something more than gratitude or admiration. It was trust, pure and simple, trust that had been earned over time, in the midst of struggles they had faced together. "I'm not sure if I'm ready," he confessed. "I've been a soldier my entire life. I've fought wars, served under commands, and followed orders. But now, it's different. I'm not just here to fight for survival. I'm here to help you rebuild, to stand beside you as more than just a soldier. But I wonder if I'm enough. Am I ready to be part of your world, your future. The princess's eyes softened, and she reached out to gently touch his arm. Her hand was warm, her touch steady. "You are enough," she said firmly, her voice filled with unwavering conviction. "You've already given more than I could have ever asked. You've given me your heart, your strength, and your loyalty. That is all I could ever ask for." Mark's chest tightened at her words. He had come here as a stranger, unsure of his place in this alien world. He had never expected to find such purpose, such a connection. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. He wasn't just helping the princess. He had grown to care for her deeply. And now he realized he wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for a future with her. "But what about your people?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Will they accept me? Will they accept a human as your partner, as a leader by your side?" The princess smiled, a rare and genuine smile that made her seem more human than alien in that moment. "They will. They will follow me, as they always have. But they will also respect my choices. And you are my choice, Mark. You've proven that you're not just a soldier. You're someone who sees beyond titles, beyond race, beyond borders. You see the person. You see me. And that is why I need you." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on him. He had never felt so deeply connected to someone before, let alone someone from another world. But there was no denying it. He had already given his heart to her, and now he was ready to give everything. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I'm ready to stay, ready to help rebuild, to be by your side. If you'll have me, princess." She stepped closer, her eyes shining with something that felt like hope, like the start of something new. "I wouldn't have it any other way." In that moment, Mark knew his life had changed forever. He had crossed the threshold from a simple soldier into something more, into a partner, a protector, and a leader in a world that was both alien and yet, somehow, home. And together, they would face whatever the future held, whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever battles they would fight. Mark knew they would stand united. He, the human soldier, and she, the alien princess. Their journey was just beginning. But with each other, they knew they could conquer anything.